evening, my name's Lucy Green. Welcome to this contagious question and answer event about tackling COVID-19 with innovative science. It's part of the Southampton Science and Engineering Festival, organised by the Public Engagement with Research Unit at the University of Southampton. The festival is on now and runs until the 14th of March. If you want to comment on social media about today's event, please use the official festival hashtag SOTSEF, that's SOTSEF. It's time to start the event, and I'd like to welcome your host for the discussion, Professor Diana Eccles, the Dean of Medicine here in Southampton. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you very much. So the COVID-19 pandemic has been a time of real struggle, sacrifice, and sometimes personal sadness for many people. People will have felt a sense of pride in the efforts made by our local communities, NHS workers, colleagues, families and friends, efforts to support others, keep us safe and save lives. We wanted to put on this event to help increase the scientific understanding around what has gone on during the pandemic. It's your chance to ask the difficult questions and hear the real science and the real scientists answering those questions. Back in March a year ago, COVID and lockdown became the centre of everyday conversations. Panic was in the air and scientists all around the world swung into action. First step was to stop the spread and minimise exposure of healthcare workers to the virus and support people. Our first panellist, Professor Paul Elkington, is a respiratory physician and working with engineering colleagues was part of the team at Southampton who developed the Perso mask to do just that. Panellists Mary Barker and Woods-Townsend were actively engaging young people whose lives have been turned upside down, researching ways that could best support them. As the pandemic unfolded, one of the most important tools to track and to trace to help people get back to work was the testing element. Panellists Godfrey, Mary Barker and Woods-Townsend joined forces with others across the university, in the hospital and in the city council to launch the saliva testing programme, which where they could detect positive COVID infection just by analysing a saliva sample. But we knew that the key to resuming life as we once knew it lay in developing a vaccine. And panellists Max Crispin, Saul, Faust and Rob Reed have been at the heart of the scientific effort to do just this and have been instrumental in getting us to the point that we can now put lockdown behind us, at least in the foreseeable future. So a warm welcome to all of you, and to those watching on Facebook or on YouTube, please post your questions in the chat. We're eager to answer as many questions as we can. So, first question. Our first question. So this question I'm going to address to Mary Barker, Professor Mary Barker. What has inspired you most about the response to COVID?
Thank you, Diana. The young people, always the young people. So we work a lot with young people, and we have been blown away by the positivity and resilience of the young people that we've been working with. They've had their lives, as you said, turned upside down. They've had no exams, they've had school cancelled, they've had really been quite lost. And yet the whole time we've been speaking to young people through the pandemic, we've heard amazing stories about incredible things that they've been doing, or just quite ordinary things that they've been doing to keep themselves busy and positive and occupied. And the amount of love they found for their families and the amount of time they've spent just doing simple things has been really, really inspiring. And it's been just the best thing for me about the pandemic.
I think it's been a calming time in many ways, hasn't it? Even though it's had very different effects on different people and different mindsets. Max, in your science capacity, what's been the most inspiring thing for you, do you feel?
Well, I guess life before the pandemic was really hectic and busy. And when all this sort of emerged, all of that seemed to sort of dissipate, and what was replaced with just a large degree of cooperation. And I ended up being in contact with all sorts of people that I knew of, but hadn't really had the chance to properly make connections with. And everybody was sort of aligned in the same shared goal of doing what they can and basically applying their skills and their resources to contribute to finding solutions in all sorts of different ways. And I found that, tremendously inspiring. And that's also outside of just the academic circles. Also, companies reached out offering their support and facilities for free. And, it's breathtaking, breath of fresh air of human cooperation, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Paul, you had a very exciting experience of that with developing the Perso-Mass. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I suppose, I think like Max, the ability for different people from different disciplines to drop everything and work together for a common goal. And so the Perso had involved the engineers at the university, a lot of clinicians and infection control teams at the hospital, and then local business, and ranging from Indo Lighting to McLaren Formula One. And everyone worked phenomenal hours at short notice to deliver these respirators, over 1,000 for the first peak, over 3,000 for the second peak. And so I think a year ago, we really didn't know how long this was going to go on for. It might have go on for 3 or 4 years. And so the way different disciplines have combined to then make it look like there should be light at the end of the tunnel now has been very inspiring.
So we've got a question coming through on the line, which might be best directed at you, Paul. But I'm going to start with Rob Reed. Why do some people's lungs suffer from the COVID virus more than others? So there's a real spectrum, I think. You might want to pass that back to Paul, but.
Well, good evening, Diana, and good evening, everyone. Well, of course, we're all different. Vive la différence. I mean, this is something that we see with other viral infections, like the influenza virus. Some people just get a nose and throat, a sore throat with influenza virus. Other people get a full-blown pneumonia. So the way that each of us responds to the presence of a virus is completely different, probably determined in part by the infecting dose, but mostly, I expect, by our genetics and other circumstances, such as what else we're infected with. I think that's the short answer.
And there are, yes. So I think there have been some quite interesting genetic studies. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that. That where people have looked at extremes of people being affected within families.
Yeah. So.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
I'm going to pass to Saul because these have been young cases, which is very unusual, I think, for COVID.
I was actually going to comment on the National Genomic Study. As Max was saying, people have collaborated across all the centres, and there's been one of those collaborations was taking part in big studies, taking all the clinical data and often genetic material and samples from people all over the country. And one of those studies was led from colleagues in Edinburgh called the Genomic Study, and they took blood samples from people on intensive care, the most severe patients, and they found that one of the pathways called the JAK inhibitor pathway, one of the genes in that pathway, was actually more likely to land you in hospital with very severe pneumonia and worse outcomes. And that's now fed back into the recovery trial of the treatments for COVID. Not only is tocilizumab working on that pathway, which was shown recently to be a benefit, but the new baricitinib drug that's being trialed in recovery as a tablet form for people with the hospital admitted form of the disease is being included in that trial because of the genetic studies that have led to that result.
And you've been practicing those complicated drug names that are very difficult to get.
We're all much better at them than the Prime Minister. That's true.
Yeah. So and informed by the science. So it's a full and very, very rapid progress of targeted therapy, which is fantastic to see that evolving and happening. So we've got another question, which might be in Saul's domain, but I'm going to give it to Keith first because we haven't heard from him yet. And Kath, your turn will come in a moment. But the question is, why are kids not getting COVID?
So it's a great question, actually, because we don't properly know as yet. There's a complicated answer being proposed related to the expression of the anchoring protein, so to speak, that the virus binds to. But if you go looking at the data that are coming out from Public Health England at the moment, on what's called pillar 2 testing, which is the tests in people who are relatives of others, for example. Actually, the rates of positive results in children are quite high, and it's likely that a lot of children are getting COVID without actually getting the symptoms of a lung infection or some of the other taste disturbance. So it's a bit of a watch this space in relation to children, and we don't really have solid, large-scale information at the moment.
So I think Rob might have a view on that, and there might be some learning
Yes.
influence.
It's really, as Keith says, this is a really interesting issue. As a general rule, the disease phenotype, in other words, the way that the disease expresses itself, can differ greatly in infectious diseases between children and adults. I mean, a good example would be glandular fever. If you catch the virus that causes glandular fever, Epstein-Barr virus, as a child, you get a very, very minor, practically unnoticed disease, whereas if you're an adult, you get polaxed by it. Likewise, chickenpox. When you see it as a kid, very, very mild infection indeed. But if you see it for the first time as an adult, again, you can get a severe pneumonia and possibly die. So this has probably got to do with something to do with tuning up your innate immunity, and of course the role of acquired immunity in partially suppressing the virus infection in adults.
And so, of course, this is the first time we've seen this particular virus ever in the population, which is partly why it's causing such havoc. So presumably in the future, if children are acquiring it just in the normal course of things, they will then subsequently largely be immune until we start getting different variants emerging. But I can see Saul's desperate to come in with a comment there.
I was just going to say, I mean, Keith's right that we are seeing, where you look in families, you can find COVID in children, but we absolutely do know from the studies that the Office for National Statistics and Public Health England have been doing, that children catch COVID less than adults and spread it less than adults. And there's lots of different data sets that show that now. And primary school children are even less likely to catch and spread COVID than secondary school children. And the secondary school infections are sort of reflecting the local society, absolutely not amplification by children. If you think of how many contact points children have in schools, and Keith's work really, and the testing scheme in Southampton has been fantastic. It's been, if I'm right, Keith, it's been quite hard for you to find positive cases, but where you found them, you've been able to act really nicely to stop further spread, haven't you?
The testing of saliva has proved very acceptable to children because the virus gets into the salivary glands in the mouth as one of the earliest places in the body that it appears. That's proved a natural part of the body, or matrix as we call it, to test. And we have found that actually that does seem, particularly if you have regular testing, to be relatively little transmission in schools, which is part of the push to enable children to resume their education. But it needs to be done in a setting where schools are taking extreme care with social distancing, with face masks, hand washing. But if you combine the testing with those measures, it does seem that you can safely continue education. In fact, where we had the testing in place in several schools in the autumn term, the school attendance rates actually increased to 94%, and we were able to prevent any within-school transmission during that period.
So I've seen some of the lovely videos that have been done by the children in different languages to help explain the sort of COVID engagement rules, if you like. I mean, Kath, do you want to make any comments about how that project, how much of a role children have in educating their families, if you like, about how to follow the rules?
Absolutely. And I think, so the work that we've been doing with children and young people is really key to make sure that they're at the heart of what's happening and involved. So much of this is about doing things to children. So here you go, this is what you've got to do now, and now you've got to do a test, and now you've got to stay apart from your friends. And actually this gives us an opportunity to involve them what's happening, so they understand the importance behind it. That's really important for them to know about why they're making those choices. But yes, they then go home and they act as those agents of change in their families to help educate their families as well.
I think that's potentially really important, particularly in the harder to reach groups of people.
And that's one of I was just going to say, that's one of the really, beautiful things about working through schools, is that all children are at school. So actually you have that opportunity to reach out into those communities via the schools.
There's a question coming through from, thanks Kath, that's great. There's a question coming through from Adam, which is what causes the cytokine storm that results in severe COVID cases, which is that was a really interesting phenomenon. As the cases started coming through, we started to understand it better. So who would like that? I think maybe Saul, would you like to take that cytokine storm?
I was going to pass that one to Rob, because there's a long disease in children one for me in a bit, isn't there?
All right, yes. Okay, so Rob, you take that, and I will come back to the long COVID. I think long COVID is something in the more general terms that's really important, long-term effects. But, yeah.
So the truth is that we don't know everything about why you get this maladaptive response to the presence of the virus. And I suppose the most interesting thing is that it happens unpredictably. In other words, you can't easily predict who's going to actually suffer this phenomenon, and it is worse in elderly people, and that's probably because of their physiology, underlying physiology, being unable to cope with the stressors associated with this. Essentially, it's cells called macrophages and monocytes that are seeing the virus for the very, as part of the first barrier of defense. And in some people, they are all at once releasing molecules called cytokines, particularly interleukin-1, interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor, in a highly uncontrolled way. A phenomenon we see in certain other infections, such as toxic shock syndrome, where for some reason we can't handle an antigen in a particularly coordinated way. And they release huge amounts of cytokines from their monocytes systemically, and this occurs certainly within the pulmonary, the breathing tubes, and also within the pulmonary circulation, and causes its most dramatic effects on the endothelial cells, the cells lining blood vessels in particular, within the lung. But it's not confined to the lung. It can also activate your clotting system. It can damage other parts of the vasculature, such as the heart, and the release of these cytokines all at once is really the primary cause of this, although we don't exactly know why it's this particular virus that's so very good at doing it. It looks a little bit like some of the viral hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola, in terms of the rapidity of the maladaptive response. But of course, it's a very different disease.
What proportion of people actually have that maladaptive response, the really severe?
So obviously, this varies by age group, but it's certainly in young adults who have less comorbidities. So we're looking at a naive host that's responding very dramatically. We're talking about 0.01%, that sort, for a really truly severe cytokine storm, to use the jargon.
That's
really low, in other words.
Yes, yeah. Okay, that's fantastic. So I'm going to come back to that long-term effects of the virus. And of course, we've only known it for a year, so it's really hard to know what long-term effects there might be. But the question is, specifically, what long-term effects might COVID have in children, even if they're asymptomatic? But you could ask the same question for adults.
Yeah, shall I take that for children first, and then somebody else can have a go for adults? I think for children, For children who are asymptomatic, we're not expecting any long-term effects of COVID because it's a respiratory virus. Children get respiratory viruses all the time, and we hope that most children will be asymptomatic, get better, and not have problems. There are some children who aren't bad and sick enough to come into hospital who might be developing a more severe form of post-viral illness, like we see for many illnesses, like glandular fever, or some people say they have it from Lyme disease. And certainly long COVID, which is more seen in adults, does seem to happen in children too. We don't know very much about this, or actually how much of what we're seeing is due to long COVID and how much is due to lockdown and symptoms that could happen because people have been locked up, not seeing their friends and so on. So there's going to be a big national study of about 30,000 people looking at people who have had COVID and not had COVID, have had COVID tests positive and test negative, and they'll be tracked over a year with online questionnaires to find out what COVID has caused and what's been caused by other things. So we'll get more data on children. And then the children who have been sick, and those are mostly with the new multi-system inflammatory disorder, so a very rare condition where only a very small, tiny fraction of children who get COVID, but then 4 or 5 weeks later come into hospital with an inflammatory syndrome. Really rare. We've seen maybe 10 or 15 cases in Southampton, but the whole region in Wessex. It's a really rare disease, and that does seem to be quite good. Children get better very quickly. Only 1 or 2 children have died, and actually they probably had other things, not just the inflammatory syndrome. But some of those children have had cardiac side effects, like children in Kawasaki disease. And Kawasaki disease is another inflammatory condition that some children get very rarely. But it's not a major, it's of concern to people like me looking after children in hospital, but not something that most people or families need to worry about.
Thank you. Mary, did you want to add something to that?
I did, because COVID may have all sorts of effects on children that are nothing to do with being infected by the virus. And the COVID response, or the response to COVID, is going to have, we know is going to have long-term effects on children. And I think I'm not going to harp on about lost generations and terrible things that are going to happen to this group of children, because actually I think they're much more resilient than that. But I do want to just say, I think that we need to be aware that there will be long-term psychological, behavioural, social effects of the response to COVID, and that there are various very important things we can do to make sure that we mitigate, that we reduce the negative consequences for young people. And the most important one of those, as far as that we've been able to find out, is that you actually listen to children and young people, and you give them a chance to talk about what's happening in their lives, to say, to have a role in how the UK has responded to COVID, and to actually take some control over their lives and situations. And we know that if you offer young people some sense of control over what's happening to them, they respond much more positively, and any potential negative consequences of all the terrible things that have happened during lockdown are reduced. And I think that's terribly important, and we should not forget it's not all about the virus, it's also about the response to the virus.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, actually. There's a huge societal
Thank you.
impact of this, which we lose sight of if we concentrate on the pathology the whole time. So really, really good point. There's the question here from Padlet. Will students being in schools create mutations that may be unaffected by the vaccine? So this is about how I suppose how frequently we expect to see variants of concern.
I don't mind starting off, Diana, if nobody else is going to. Oh, Rob, you go.
Well, okay. I mean, it's no accident that the variants of concern that are emerging have been emerging from centres of very high transmission rates of the virus. So, for example, Brazil, South Africa, where there was uncontrolled epidemics, and also, I'm afraid, the UK, where we also had no control in February, March, April, May. And the reason for this, of course, is that the more the virus transmits, the more it faces that selective pressure, and the more abundant the virus is, the more replication of virus occurs, the likelier it is that mutation will occur, because mutation occurs when the virus, if you like, replicates. So in other words, the more it's transmitting, the more it will mutate, and the more it will get selected. I suppose I'm going to send this back to Saul, because whether you believe that the schools will be a hotspot of transmission and therefore potentially mutation, and of course Max may want to comment on this as well. But Saul, what do you think?
Thanks, Rob. I don't think the schools are, because I think for all the reasons you've just said, we're locking down and we're opening schools very carefully with testing, and we're immunizing the adult population to stop the wider community transmission. And we really are going to control this time, so we don't have to go back to another full lockdown. It might be by the end of the year that we have enough information about the vaccines in children and how they work in adults to make a decision about whether to immunize secondary school children, not to protect the children from getting COVID, but to prevent transmission, to stop future mutations. But we don't know enough about the vaccines in children yet, or whether enough about which ones prevent transmission best to make those decisions about how to immunize kids in due course. But I would guess we might see an immunization program in secondary schools probably January, February next year, if not a bit later, and maybe primary schools the year after, or towards the end of 2022. But that's just a guess based on how slowly we're going to have to do the paediatric trials to get the data we need for people on the committees to make the decisions.
I'm going to ask Max to comment in a minute on the vaccine question that's coming through. Yeah. But before that, can I get Keith, because you've seen the pattern of infection in schools and in universities with all the testing. Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think Saul and others have carefully set out. It's unlikely that transmission in schools is going to increase variants of concern, and we're now in a really good place where we're going to be monitoring these variants, and if any are picked up that seem likely to escape the vaccines, I think the surge testing really is a smart play to counteract that. So I think eventually we are, quotes, getting our act together with a comprehensive integrated package of the transmission prevention, hands, face, space, testing and vaccines. And it's really with this sort of package, and with people understanding that it matters what they do, and that's where the engagement is so important. So I think that we are getting into a better place. But people like Susan Hopkins from Public Health England are right to signify that we can't be complacent come the autumn and even over the coming months, and that if we do relax our guard, there is a risk of another wave later in the year.
And Max, did you want to comment on that particular issue, or can I put to you the vaccine
question, and I'll weave in some aspects.
So I wanted to just let you have first swipe at the question that's come through, which says, what made it possible to develop a vaccine so quickly? Yeah,
that's a superb question, and there's multiple hierarchies of answer here, isn't there? I mean, the blunt message is that the prior investment in vaccine technologies we've been, has really accelerated the ability for the community to respond. So this has not been from a standing start. And I think a big shout out should go to those organisations that have been supporting vaccine development, sometimes to incredibly difficult targets. For example, there's still no HIV vaccine, and yet the progress in vaccine development of vaccine technologies has been immense. And many of the same researchers who've been really pushing out the frontiers against those types of targets have pivoted to roll out the vaccines that we see for coronavirus. So that's one answer, is that this hasn't come from nowhere. Society has been putting in investment already, and those experts are in place. The other side of it, though, is there is new technology that's been wheeled out, and that there's some of the aspects of that question is what made it so quick. Well, you know, some of the leading technologies that we're seeing, the adenovirus-based vaccines, the so-called Oxford AstraZeneca one, the nucleic acid-based forms, the so-called RNA vaccines like Moderna and Pfizer, you know, these ones have been rolled out as sort of first-in-class examples of those platforms and shown the power of these technologies. And of course, the more traditional vaccines are also working. So that's another thing I think it's important for us to emphasize, is one of really positive news, is that there's been so little failure of the vaccine candidates that have been brought forward.
No, it has been absolutely amazing. I think that the rapidity and the fact that we're now so far into vaccinating our whole population. I have a question here from Alex, who's 11, and I'm going to ask Kath to answer this. So, does hand washing work?
Absolutely.
He says it kills 99.9% of bacteria, but what can it really do against COVID?
Absolutely, it can work, and we all need to be making sure we're washing our hands. So when you wash your hands with soap and water, you break down the natural oil on your hands, which helps the virus not stick, and then the water can wash it away. The soap also breaks down the outer cover on the virus again, which helps to destroy it, so that we're getting rid of it from our hands. So absolutely, it's really important that we're washing our hands at all opportunities.
Fantastic. And for the duration, 20 seconds, happy birthday twice round, or some such. Okay, so the next one I think is from Padlet, and this is really for I'm sure for Keith. So which COVID test is best? Why aren't all schools using saliva tests rather than swab tests? Is the saliva test comparable with lateral flow?
So there's no one best test, and that's something that's complicated, but we've got to get our heads around it. There's a best test for use in hospitals, which is the PCR test, and for people who have symptoms, and that is the most sensitive test, but it also picks up fragments of the virus during the recovery period, which may no longer be infectious. So if you're going out to people in the community and picking up those who have acquired the infection but not yet having any symptoms, you actually are better off probably going for one of these so-called rapid tests. Now, the lateral flow tests have had a lot of bad press out there, some of which probably isn't justified because they don't pick up the fragments of virus in the recovery period that are not infectious. But that's less important if you're trying to stop transmission in the community. And the upside of them is you get an answer within 30 minutes, so you don't need to wait around for it to go to a lab. But the downside is that because they don't amplify, so to speak, the small amounts of the virus RNA, the nucleic acid, they're less sensitive than tests like the saliva test. So it is horses for courses, and the saliva test has the joy of often, for most people, being more acceptable because it doesn't require a swab up the nose, but it does have to go to a laboratory. And actually it's proved quite challenging to process thousands, tens of thousands of samples using the saliva test in a laboratory. And we're only just getting to a place where this can be made available across the UK. So in essence, whatever test you can have, you should have. If you've got symptoms, you should definitely have an NHS PCR test. If you're in a school or other setting and you haven't got symptoms, then the lateral flow test can pick up those people who are most infectious with the highest amounts of virus, even though they don't pick up everybody. The saliva test's more accurate, but it has to go off to a laboratory to have the test performed. So that's not a straightforward answer, I'm afraid, but that is how it is.
It's a horses for courses answer in a way, isn't it? So it depends on what your objective is in doing the test, and I think that's probably what would sum that answer up, perhaps.
Much better put than I.
But there's a related question here, a chaser question. I'm going to get Paul to be the first to answer this. So as a respiratory physician, so the question is there a specific vaccine? Is one better than the other? And would you have the right to refuse one over the other?
I was probably going to defer to Rob on that, but I certainly think having a vaccine is a good thing, and everyone should have the vaccine. You can argue that one may be better than the other, but on the whole, I think just having, the evidence is very, very tight. And I think the approach that the Germans have taken of saying the English vaccine isn't very good is a very sort of short-term approach. They've said, well, we're looking to over the age of 65. So they've taken some approaches, and I think that hasn't helped them control it at all. So my personal view is you shouldn't decline a vaccine. You should go ahead and have it. And as time, what's emerging is how good all the vaccines are and how protective they are.
Yeah, no, exactly right. But we're going to let Rob follow that up.
As my colleagues in Germany said, the best vaccine is the one that you can get first. But on a serious note, I've been with others seeing some national data this morning, and I can tell you that the vaccines are excellent, and they're no different to each other in terms of performance at a national level. So I am delighted to see that. And no, there isn't really one vaccine better than the other, and you're just better off getting the one that you're offered first. The only reason for turning down a particular vaccine would be if you know that you have an allergic reaction to that specific vaccine. So that's really the only reason to be at all selective about it.
But I think that the take-up rate for this vaccine is really, really high, because
it's stunning. The uptake rates, especially in the older population, is just unprecedented. This is starting to look like the childhood schedule in terms of the uptake in adults, which is incredible. Yeah. I mean, the thing that we're working on at the moment, as you'll be aware, is trying to get specific groups, particularly in deprived areas, to take up the vaccine, and also some ethnic groups as well, to encourage vaccine use everywhere, uniformly.
So there's lots of questions coming in now. I'm going to have to speed up. If someone's had bad effects to the COVID vaccine, does that mean they're likely to have better protection against the virus? So that's a really good question, because that's a shame. So it bears no resemblance.
It's been looked at actually formally, and there is this phenomenon that people think that because you get a reaction to the vaccine, that's your immune system working. But actually, when people have tried to compare the immunological response to the vaccine with the symptoms shortly after use of the vaccine, they can't find any difference at all. So, it seems plausible that it should be so, but actually, there's no difference in people who do or do not have a response.
Well, I'm disappointed, but that's very helpful to know that for sure. So there's another question here. What will happen to us if another different virus hits?
So that depends on what the virus is. If it's a coronavirus, we've got pretty good technologies now, so we can make vaccines quickly. If it's flu, we're also quite a long way ahead in preparing for what different types of flu might be and bringing vaccines forward. For other diseases like Ebola or new diseases that we don't know about yet, I guess we've learned a lot about the social and societal things we need to do in a pandemic. And we hope we're going to be better next time. But I think this is where Mary or Max or Keith or Kath might want to come in, because it's probably more to do with the social and societal things than the vaccine technology.
Any more, Mary?
Keith, you desperate to say something?
No, go ahead, Mary.
I mean, I think it's we've all learned such a lot in the last year about all sorts of things, including human behaviour and how human beings respond to this enormous global threat. And I think it's been salutary for all of us to learn lots of lessons. But also, I mean, call me an optimist, but I have been amazingly cheered by people's response to the restrictions put on them. If you told everybody a year ago that in a year's time they'd be shut in their houses for the majority of the day and they wouldn't be allowed to see their friends or their family, you'd imagine there'd be some kind of riot. Well, there has been no riot, and more or less, and people have been extraordinarily compliant and very consistent about that and very resilient. And I think if there is another virus that hits us, I think we kind of know what to do and we sort of know what to expect, and there is a sense of security in the familiarity of knowing what we might do. And I have faith in human beings to respond appropriately, particularly having lived through the last year.
In fact, that sort of relates to another question about why don't we self-isolate and lock down during the flu season. I'm wondering whether we should do that every year, like a fire drill, just once a year, have a few weeks of lockdown. But we don't. So Keith.
I think it's fair to say that we as a country were really ill prepared for this, and way more ill prepared than societies out in the Far East. And frankly, it's not that we hadn't been warned. There are some very powerful reports indicating that we should have got our act together several years ago. I worked quite a bit in the Far East, and societies like Hong Kong actually had experienced SARS. They were much quicker to put in place the appropriate measures for COVID, and wearing masks when there's virus around became widely prevalent very quickly in those sort of societies. And I know that government will not be so ill prepared again. There is planning going on to put in place the infrastructure for not just vaccination at scale, but testing at scale. And what we've learned about the behavioural measures that we need to work with the population to do, and frankly the scientific literacy, which is why this sort of session is so great. It's only through doing that with the next generation that you get people in a place where you can control these without having to go to extreme measures like lockdowns. So, you know, we should get ourselves in a place where we never have to go down this route again. And the lessons that were learnt in the Far East should be applied in the UK going forwards.
That's really
just follow on from that as well. I think there's a real opportunity with what we're doing with schools and education to take this moment to think about how we're educating young people about science and how we're increasing scientific literacy, so that actually when things like this happen, we're much better prepared as a society to be able to understand the science, make choices, and understand what the impact of those choices are for ourselves, but also for the wider community.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And maybe that's one thing where this generation of children who've come through the pandemic will have some head start against the current generation.
Absolutely. They're going to be living with the fallout of what we're going through, and how we prepare them for that and how we prepare them to help us come out of this, I think will really define us as a society, really.
Just like global climate change, we need to listen to young people because they are the people who can really help us to build a society that is resilient.
I'm going to switch tack slightly. Thank you. Onto we're going to come to PPE. So perso kits. Why aren't these being used by all frontline workers? And just how did you scientifically test?
So I suppose I'll answer the how did we test it first. So the original prototypes, what we did is we did the test you use for the face fit testing. So you make a little aerosol spray with a hand pump, and it has a very bitter tasting solution. And if you can taste it around your surgical mask or your tight fitting mask, it means the mask is leaking. So we did that and we sprayed it into the filter and it showed it didn't come through. And similarly, we did tests where you blow the air over an agar plate and you count how many colonies of bacteria grow. And so you check that the air is being sterilized. So we did various tests like that on the initial prototype, and we showed the principle worked, that it filtered out all the particles which might be carrying coronavirus particles. In terms of the rollout, I mean, this hospital in Southampton, 3,500 healthcare workers have requested one and been given one during the second wave. And so everyone who wants a perso has been given one. I think in terms of the national rollout, we've been lobbying for national rollout, but I think what it identifies, it comes back to the point about the country not being really prepared for a pandemic. The sort of regulatory processes and structures which have built up over the years of peace from 1950 to now move so slowly and glacially that to make a sudden change to a new type of provision goes through some very slow regulatory processes which are still ongoing. So we've been able to enact this change in Southampton, but forcing the change more widely nationally. I mean, 22 trusts have invested in persos, and so there has been some impact, but it's actually quite difficult to have national or international change because the processes move at a different pace to the virus, which moves very quickly.
Yeah. So let's see. So here's a question. Do you think, and I'm going to address this first to Rob, I think, do you think lockdown easing on the 21st is too soon? How many people need to have the vaccine to stop another wave?
There are some very pointy-headed mathematicians trying to answer the second one, and I'm afraid it is the realm of mathematics. By June, we should have got down to at least to cohort 10, I suspect. So in other words, the 40 to 49-year-olds. That means that we should have protected approximately 99% of the population who are dying following their infection with coronavirus by then. So that's the kind of equation that you're dealing with. At the same time, you need to bring down the abundance of the virus as quickly as you can, and that's what the lockdown's been about. The lockdown has enabled us to deploy vaccine and thereby amplify the effect of the vaccine on protecting vulnerable members of the population from the virus. So the two are going hand in hand. We can't afford, I know I'm towing the party line here, but we can't afford to ease the lockdown any quicker than the Prime Minister has planned, in my opinion. And that's because we really do have an awful lot of virus in the UK, more than in many other European countries, actually. So that's the reason why we need to come down very, very slowly. And it will enable our vaccines to work. But I can't answer your second question because I'm not a modeler. It's a really hard question.
And we don't have any modelers here, and probably the modelers are only as good as the data that's going into the model. So I think that's where we probably leave that bit of the question. But there's another one from YouTube, which I'm afraid, Rob, is probably going to be on your desk as well, which is what research are you aware of, if any, was used to inform the decision to not prioritise vaccinations for frontline police officers and staff?
That's a really good question. And in fact, this point is being debated hotly on JCVI, of which I'm a member. It boils down to this, that there are three reasons, really. First of all, the deployment is going really well using the conventional GP-driven system of age age stratification of virus deployment. The system is working brilliantly, and if we disturb it to try and go for specific occupational groups, then we risk losing the momentum. Secondly, if you're going to target one particular occupational group, well, actually, when the large epidemiology studies looked at which occupational groups were associated with the severe outcomes of coronavirus, it wasn't the police, it wasn't teachers, it was actually certain factory workers, food processing workers in particular. And thirdly, actually, in the situation we're currently in at the moment, where we're just probably going down through 1 in 200 of the population being infected, the danger of uncontrolled mass gatherings, which is where the police do come into contact with the virus, perhaps at a higher rate than other occupations, that danger is receding. So it's obviously a dynamic situation, but that's really the sum of it. First of all, protecting the most vulnerable people in the population as quickly as we possibly can. Secondly, not discriminating against occupational groups who certainly do have higher rates of disease. And thirdly, the changing dynamics of the epidemic.
But it's an interesting point, though, isn't it, Rob? Because actually police officers go into people's homes, and they go into very vulnerable people's homes very often. And that's nothing to do with mass gatherings, and that's happening all the time.
Yes, but those homes will have currently an infection rate of probably less than 1 in 200 at this present point in time. So the balance of risks between vaccinating as quickly as possible your 40 to 49-year-olds versus disturbing the program in order to specifically target police, that's the calculation that is being made. And remember, police can use PPE when they go into people's homes, so it's not a very easy question to address. Trust me, we've had sleepless nights about it. It's not a decision that was taken lightly. And it's continuously under review. JCVI is reviewing this and many other questions twice a week.
Yeah. It is really challenging, and that's a really helpful answer, actually. So we're running out of time, so I'm going to come to the last question from Padlet. So do you think, and I haven't decided who's going to answer this yet, do you think this pandemic has benefited the awareness of the medical and scientific community? And if so, how? So I think that means the awareness of the general public of the work of the medical and scientific community. So, Max, you haven't spoken for a while. Do you want to take that one first?
Well, yeah, and I have to say I agree that it has. And we saw the outpouring of support for the NHS. And I think a lot of people will reflect that we're quite lucky. We've got some good institutions in this country, and we have some of the most vulnerable people in society get a lot of supports. And I think that's been that's a sort of shared view across the country. And I think that's come through really strongly.
Mary,
I think there's been an amazing impact actually of the scientific discourse around the pandemic, and suddenly everybody's a virologist, everybody's an immunologist, everybody's terribly expert about things that frankly they knew nothing about and cared less about a year ago. And though I'm sure there's an awful lot of nonsense talked, actually what we've got is a vastly increased interest in science and in medicine and healthcare, and that is only a good thing. And as Kath and Keith have both said, we have a moment here in society where we can promote scientific literacy in the whole population, but particularly in young people, because we have access to young people through schools. But if we can do that, then we have a long-term positive impact on the quality of the scientific research we conduct, the people's sort of data literacy, their ability to understand and read and interpret data and scientific data is vastly improved, which makes people much more responsive, much more self-aware, and much better able to manage their own health and their own choices. And that is only a good thing. And that's been a real surprise, I think, from the pandemic.
I think building on that whole agenda of helping people become more responsible for their own health, I think that is a really important point. Does anybody want to add anything to that?
Diana, the other thing that we've also seen, sadly, is an epidemic of misinformation. Yeah. And I mean, that really drives a need to help people access quality information and find ways of utilizing that information. And it's down to us to stop talking gobbledygook and try and say it in a plainer, simpler, more intelligible way. And it's that partnership between scientists and the community. And I think scientists haven't done that as well as they need to in the past. So we need to help our students, our adults of tomorrow, be able to utilize the information, but we need to try and communicate it in much better ways. And we need to develop better systems for trusted information that people can go to. And I still don't think we've got that right. And we need to look at that very carefully.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point, actually. And maybe that's a good point to wrap up what has been a really, really interesting conversation, really insightful answers, really helpful answers. And I just want to thank all of our panelists this evening. You've done a fantastic job in addressing those questions and communicating the great advances that have happened in science and medicine. I'm going to go back and have a look at my my little script here, because that will tell me we've got 3 minutes to go. And actually, so that sounds like we might have time for one final question, which, so I'm going to say, so here's a really quick question for the last few minutes. Can someone who is positive for COVID, Saul can answer this one, can someone who's positive for COVID but asymptomatic still have their vaccine?
So if you've had COVID, you can still have your vaccine. All the trials were done with 10 to 15% of people having had COVID. We know that from the test they had on the first day. And if you're asymptomatic, you won't know that you've got COVID. When you go and have your vaccine, it'll be all right. So yes is the answer. Don't worry.
If you had a test yesterday, your lateral flow or your saliva test, and
you wait for a month. You wait for a month if you know you're positive, yeah. So
that was the question. So we have our answer. That's excellent. So I think at that point, I think we have now we have really got to finish. So I just want to thank all of the panelists for a very good, very dynamic session. And I think at this point I'm going to hand back to Lucy, if she's there.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you so much to all the panelists. I hope you've all enjoyed this session as much as I have. It's been a great discussion. Before you go, though, please take part in this short anonymous survey. We'd like to know your thoughts about today's live stream so that we can improve future events. You can scan the QR code on your phone, click on the link in the chat, or visit this URL. Don't forget that this event is part of the Southampton Science and Engineering Festival, also known as SOTSEF, and it's on now until the 14th of March. To know more about the festival, including other events to do with the science behind COVID-19, and to book free tickets and save dates in your diaries to join other live events, please visit sotsef.co.uk. Good evening.